Welcome to the Atlas Talks with your host, Debra Atlas. A former FBI Special Agent Larry Wansley gained prestige as an undercover agent codenamed Mandrake. His book, FBI Undercover, The True Story of Special Agent Mandrake, tells us his funny and gripping story setting up busts on fraudsters, truck hijackers, murderers, mafia wise guys, assorted crooks, and more. He's also been Whitney Houston's bodyguard, head of security for American Airlines on 9/11, and Director of Security for the Dallas Cowboys. Larry Wansley is a real-life Forrest Gump.
Welcome to everyone to the first episode of the Atlas Talks, Engaging with Depression. I'm the host, Debra Atlas, and I'm here with Larry Wansley. And Larry, you've had quite a remarkable career. You started as a Marine after you graduated high school. You're a former FBI undercover agent, which I find amazingly fascinating. You've worked on some high-profile things, including the search for Patty Hearst, and have recovered millions of dollars worth of stolen property, and that's a very big deal. You were the head of security for American Airlines right as 9/11 happened, and then you had to deal with all of that, and we'll talk about that a little bit. You also have become the director of counseling and of security for the Dallas Cowboys, and since I live in Texas, that's pretty great. And you are the co-author of an amazing book called FBI Undercover, The True Story of Special Agent Mandrake, and I definitely want to know more about that. You've had a remarkable career, and I watched a couple of videos that you had done, and something that you said really struck me, that you said you feel you've been emblazoned in moments of historical moments. That's a very large statement to make, and I'd like to, as we go through this today, to talk a little bit more about some of those, because that has an impact on you when you are involved in historical moments. And being in the military and working with the undercover and working with the Dallas Cowboys, all of that has an impact on you both personally and professionally. And so given that my book that I wrote is about, you aren't depression's victim, I also want to see how you see that professionally, how that has affected your career, how that has affected your life, and how you see that with the people that you work with. So I guess the first question is, with some of these momentous situations that you've been in the midst of, how has that affected you, and how have you learned to cope with something like that, those things? Because that's not an easy thing to do.
I'm learning to cope with it every second of every day, and I sincerely mean that. For example, the events that I've been involved in over the very, very many, many years, each one has impacted me, and certainly I really haven't figured it out, so to speak. I've gotten through it. I've had many, many conversations with the man in the mirror. Mm-hmm. Many of them. To this day, I have them, because who knows what's happening out there. And I will say that, yes, there have been many, many situations that I've been through, starting when I was just a young rookie police officer in Compton, California, in the Watts riot. 3 days on the job, and I'm in a firefight.
Wow.
For my life. And it's like, whoa, didn't really expect this. Yeah. But somehow you get through it. And it's just been a continuum of those kinds of situations throughout my lifetime. Undercover, the years that I spent undercover probably have had the most profound effect on me in terms of understanding, self-understanding. Certainly not a lot of studies or anything like that, involvement with learned people and counseling and that sort of thing with respect to how I internalized or dealt with some of those situations. But undercover, the years undercover were absolutely incredible in the sense that I was probably one of the loneliest people around, or certainly in the world. Those people that have been through that experience, that have worked it, have had those kinds of experiences, would probably agree. But I never felt so lonely in my life as when I was undercover, because I was someone else.
Yeah.
If there was a slip up, I might die. I internalized a lot of the actions, the dialogue that took place, the interactions with people, because, as I said, I slipped up, it was all over. Yeah. And consequently, and I'll share this with you, from 1976 until probably just a few years ago, when I really sort of settled into the sanctity, quote unquote, of the football business. And I apologize for that phone interference. But I lost my point there for a second. But anyway, in the undercover world, I found myself really doing a lot of self-critiquing. And I'll put it in this simple formula. You learn as much about the person or the people that you're going to interact with. You think about it. It's certainly not scripted, but you try to think about all the contingencies of what you're about to do, or however that may work. You think about them. When it's showtime, so to speak, then it's gut instinct. You go about doing what you need to do to accomplish the mission or reach your goal or whatever it is that you're doing. But then afterward, Debra, the most critical thing I learned for me was that I would critique myself endlessly. I said this, they reacted this way. They said this, they said that, I did this. And after a while, I spent so much time really going through all that it was a very, very confusing and exhausting process. Consequently, I never slept more than 3 hours at any one time since 1976 until just a few years ago. When I say a few years ago, this is after I settled back into the sanctity of football, so to speak, the normalcy,
Yes.
that world that was calmer and a little more normal. I mean, it's an exotic world in itself, but those are the struggles that I went through. I certainly wanted to sleep more. I wanted to rest more, but I was always on edge. And so the dynamics of everything that took place during those years really served to kind of make me who I am, because I still question how I respond to some things. I still think about, can I do better? Can I be more effective? How does this impact other people? How do I impact other people? And are these people walking away thinking that I'm some kind of a nut? I'm crazy, that I'm off my tracks or whatever? Or am I simply making sense? And I don't know if I'm making any sense right now to you, but these are all the things that really impact me. And those are the things that I think about.
When people critique themselves, I'll use the word that you use. I would have used a different word, but that's a good word. Endlessly. It can have an effect on your perspective, and it can even turn to negative thinking and self-talk. And it's very challenging when you are analytical. I come from a family that's very analytical. I come from a family of type A's. And so I'm used to that. But I also know what a fine-edged sword it can be. So I can definitely relate to, that pattern that you've had for so many years and how challenging it can be.
When I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
No, when you mentioned, yes, it is a fine-edged sword because there are some positive aspects to it because it can help you get better and feel better about yourself. But it is a very, very thin line.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to talk about your life with the FBI, as an undercover agent. How many years were you involved with the FBI?
10 years.
10 years. How did you end up going? You didn't go directly from the Marines to the FBI, did you?
No, it was a path of various steps. I got into law enforcement quite by accident, only because I ran into a friend that I was on the same Marine Corps football team with, who was going to take a test, and I gave him a ride to do that. I learned that the test was for a police officer, which I had no interest in. I was studying engineering at the time. But I wound up taking the test to kill some time, for lack of a better description. I wound up passing the test. He didn't. I got the job, and the friendship was a little strained.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But after I passed the test and I learned more about it, and I thought, well, this could be interesting. Certainly, they made a lot more money at the time than I envisioned, or certainly as a student I was making. Anyway, I became a police officer in Compton, California, and Compton has a special place in my heart. It was one of those things where, as a young rookie, my third day on the job, I was put into the street along with 11 of my other rookie classmates because we were right in the midst of the Watts riot. And historically speaking, Compton was a nice bedroom community. That's where people went to shop, to dine, et cetera, et cetera. And it just happened to be right next to Watts. And at that time, and many people are kind of shocked by this, but Compton was an affluent, quiet bedroom community.
Right.
90+% white in population, and then Samoan and Hispanic and Black, the rest of the demographic. But it was one of those things where the riot came to Compton in short order, and I, along with my 11 other rookies, were put into the field with experienced officers to respond to the shooting and all that sort of stuff. Right. Well, that was on my third day on the job. I was in the academy 3 days.
Wow.
And 20 minutes into my first session, my first shift on patrol, my partner and I were ambushed. So we're in a firefight.
Wow.
Welcome to law enforcement. Welcome to Compton. Welcome to the riotous years of
straight into the frying pan.
The mid 60s, yes.
Yeah.
But I learned that I had for lack of a better description, I don't want to say liking, because people will think that, hey, this guy is really strange now. But it was exciting. It was challenging. That got me onto the law enforcement path. I went up the ranks rather quickly. And then the FBI and the CIA were recruiting me. I was the head of detectives at the time. And the agency had plans for me, which actually intrigued me. And until I found out that they wanted me to, after some specialized training, go to South Africa, be assigned in South Africa as part of the anti-apartheid movement. With someone, an American with my background and everything else, and at the time, I had a wife and a baby, and I thought, no, this is not the responsible thing to do. And the FBI sounds a lot tamer, if you will, for me, and that's what I decided to do. The irony is, after joining the FBI, one of the first things that I wound up being involved in is that was the advent of the FBI going into undercover work, covert work, what have you. And back then, for people like me, when I say people like me coming from law enforcement and everything, had some experience, but the FBI didn't really do that sort of stuff.
So this was new at the time?
This was a new phenomenon in that this was after the passing of the famed director J. Edgar Hoover, and the FBI didn't really do much of that kind of thing. Well, when he passed, the world sort of opened up, and the FBI then began to get into those kinds of activities and what have you. And there I am. There weren't many black agents at the time in the FBI, and I sort of drifted into that. I didn't drift into that world. I was put into it rather quickly because the Patty Hearst kidnapping situation by the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army, and that was the time of the Black Panthers and a lot of domestic turmoil and what have you. So I got into the situation, obviously the search for Patty Hearst, but the mission was to infiltrate and become involved in the radical or the revolutionary, Black militant movement. That got me started. And then
how did you keep your balance? Because when you're, was a very incredibly radical and violent group, from all that I understand about it. And I was young during that time, and I lived in South Texas, so we didn't have all the information as to living in California. But the impact on you personally the toll must have been huge. How did you find your balance while you were doing all of that?
I'm not really sure if I did while I was doing that, because frankly, it was the thrill of the chase. It was this wild, crazy new world with a lot of really dangerous, violent stuff that was going on. Yeah. And as a young law enforcement type, young agent and whatever, and there weren't many of us. There were 4 of us that were basically assigned, that were put into those positions, and those were 3 other Black agents from around the country. And back then, there weren't that many of us Black agents in the FBI, so we knew one another or knew of one another. And we were brought together in California, and we were given the mission to basically become a part of this whole scene. And the impetus was, number one, find Patty Hearst. That was it. But as you're doing that, infiltrate these various groups and become part of that culture, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how it all got started. Ironically enough, you mentioned South Texas. As a rookie FBI agent, my first field office was in San Antonio.
Really?
I showed up in San Antonio, and I was the first Black FBI agent assigned to San Antonio. Yeah. And I came from Action City. I came from Compton. That was life that you see on TV. And
welcome to culture shock.
It was phenomenal. San Antonio was, as you know, it was a very, very nice, quiet, sleepy military town. Yeah. Great cultural exposure in terms of, food and the Hispanic culture and everything else. And it was a wonderful place to live if you were really sort of looking to kind of settle down and just enjoy life. Yeah. I'm a guy coming from Compton. I was wound pretty tight. So frankly, it was it was a little boring to begin with. So when Patty Hearst came along, it reignited that excitement and what have you that I'd lived for during those years in Compton. Yeah. And as I said, that's what got me back onto the track and working undercover for all those years and various entities and assignments and so forth. So I had 5 separate identities over that period of time. And it was absolutely tough. It was incredibly tough as a family man, having a family. None of the norms for families existed. And that is a regret that I have, I live with every day. In some way, something will take me back to something that I missed with my family, with my children and what have you, my wife. And so consequently, those are things that play upon the mindset also.
So when you were undercover, you were completely separated from your family for long periods of time, or was it months and years?
It was long periods of time. It was more months than anything. And then in order to reconnect with my family, it took a lot of contingency planning. I mean, it was a strategical operation just in order for me be able to spend, a day or a few days with my family, once a month or something like that. It was a very, very elaborate process to be able to do that, because the world that I lived in, my alter ego, if you will,
Right.
lived in, was totally separate from the normal family life that one would expect.
I can only imagine the huge mental shift that you had to make from stepping out of one world and stepping back into your regular life, and then having to make the shift again, going back. How can you talk about that just a little bit?
Well, my wife and I made a deal early on, and that was, she made me promise, and it was rightfully so, and I firmly believed it, that when I did come home, I would leave the other guy outside. I'd leave that world. I'd totally get away from that.
Yeah.
And it worked for a short time at first, but after a while, she got to the point, it got to the point with us where we would talk about it, and she said, sometimes I don't know who you are. I don't know if it's you or if it's this other guy, but those personalities, those habits, those traits, and everything else began to meld, and it was a real struggle. It really was, because she would mention it, I would think about it, and then I'd realize, yeah, she's right.
Yeah,
I've got to make some changes and what have you, and it was very, very, very tough. So I just absolutely admire and respect anyone that is in that kind of a position now today, with the world being what it is. It's certainly a much more dangerous and volatile world, but some of those factors still remain the same.
yeah.
And so consequently, it's a tough life. I'll just put it that way.
I cannot even imagine the impact that it had on your kids as well as your wife, and on their perspective about things, maybe their perspective about family things. Is that something that you all have talked about over the years?
Yes, and we still have discussions about those years now, and especially family gatherings and that kind of thing. And my children, my son and daughter, obviously they're adults and their own lives and what have you. But we talk about those times because something will happen or what have you, and we'll start talking about those situations. But take, for example, a situation where your child goes to school, then everyone with children in school goes through the same situation, a similar situation where, what do your parents do? Or it's bring your dad or your mom to school day, and all of those kinds of things. There were times when my children didn't know what I did. My children were frightened of me because there would be those times when I would show up after being gone for a long time, a month or something like that, and here this strange guy would show up, long hair, full beard, this foreign person, and it's like, who is this guy? My wife reminds me, that I used to terrify my kids when I would show up. And that was totally something that we didn't think about, that we really had to work on. There were times when traveling together, and I cite one of those instances where we were going to visit my folks at Christmas in Missouri, but I couldn't travel with them. I couldn't appear to be traveling with them. I was nearby, but my son, who was a youngster then, he was probably, can't remember, but he was probably around 5 or something like that. And he asked my wife if Daddy still loves them, because I wasn't with them. We were in LA airport. They were traveling separately. And he asked my wife, well, why didn't I love them anymore? That's a crushing blow. I mean, it really is. So the dynamics, everything that took place during those times were simply heartbreaking. But then on the other side, you had this crazy guy, me, who's really caught up in the thrill of the chase of these crooks. And I've got one up on them because they believe I'm like them, and we're close, and we're really striving for this goal of taking these folks down. So we've got all of those things that are taking place, and didn't necessarily recognize it until much later.
Yeah. Another part of your life that I can only be clear that there was trauma and all kinds of huge emotional gamut running was 9/11. At that time you were the head of security, corporate security for American Airlines. Is that correct?
Yes, I was. I left the FBI, and the Cowboys made me one of those offers, and I became the player, counselor, operations, security, all of that. It was the first in the history of the league for any club. Wow. But then after 10 years in football, I had another opportunity to go to American Airlines as the head of global security. Okay. And that's how I wound up at the airline during 9/11. But those momentous events that I alluded to early during the time prior to 9/11 and then 9/11 and afterward, I was there. I was an integral part of those happenings, so to speak.
Yeah. You saw the United flight hit the South Tower, the North, South. I was getting confused which was first. The second. That morning event was one where I received the notification that we had a missing airplane, and I called the FBI. I reported to the vice chairman at the time. I called the FBI and to report we had a missing airplane, and there are protocols that are in place for that. And I was on the line with the head of the Dallas FBI division, and we both had our respective TVs on. And there was a report that a small airplane had hit the North World Trade Center tower, and we're both watching it as we were speaking about my hijacking. And the reporter stated that it was a small aircraft, and we both concluded that it must be, a private aircraft out of Teterboro or what have you. And about the time I said, let's get back to my hijacking, that's when we both watched United 175 go into the South Tower. That changed the world then. Yeah, definitely so. A question that I probably know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway, is along with the humongous roller coaster of emotions, has PTSD been something that you've had to deal with from that you saw other folks who were involved in the aftermath of 9/11 going through? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Prior to that, in my role and my department's role within the company, within the airline, we had been exposed to and worked very tragic events, plane crashes, bombings, attacks around the world on our facilities and on our people. So a catastrophe was a normal part of our lives until 9/11. 9/11 really put everything, that whole dynamic on steroids, if you will. And the loss of life, the fact that numbers of our elements of our government didn't come together or communicate or whatever, and we had this tremendous loss of life at the time, was one that really impacted all of us because it changed how we went about doing our business after that. It changed everything. One of the things that really got to me, and that was being in the at ground zero, down in the pit, as you know, the recovery efforts are going on constantly, down in the tunnels and the muck and the mud and the water and everything else, and body parts floating around, and it's just a horrific scene. But one thing that I'll always remember, and that is seeing an elderly gentleman who was off to the side, and he had a rake, and he was just raking at the ground, just so totally focused. And I was with fire and police officials there, and I asked about this fellow that I saw over there. And I said, what is the situation? Why isn't someone helping him? And I was told, and it just broke my heart at the time, they told me that this gentleman was a retired firefighter, and he was there because his two sons, his two boys, were also firefighters, and he was looking for them. They were victims of that incident, and he was so totally focused. And they said, we've tried to help him. We've tried to do everything we possibly could to help him, to take him away from this and everything else, or give him people to just be around him. And he did not want any part of it. He just wanted to singularly, himself, individually, work through that to find his boys. And I had tears flowing. I mean, I was just so choked up, because you imagine situations like that with, say, your own children, or a loss of a child or something of that nature. Never, ever, ever will forget that.
I know people that I lived in New York for a number of years before moving to the West Coast. And I knew people that had passed, and I have good friends who lost family members. It's something they never get over. You never get over.
You don't.
And, how did you, I don't even know quite how to ask the question. But clearly all of our lives were changed from that. Our perspectives changed from that. How did you go about being able to make the shift with all of that, and yet be able to be effective in the face of what was going on?
Conversations with, again, the man in the mirror, with myself, constant reminders, going back to every day at American Airlines. And I traveled, obviously, a lot, but those days when I was going to be in the headquarters office, and I would drive through DFW Airport, and as I'm going to our headquarters, I would constantly be looking over at the ramp, the planes, and all the activity and everything. And I don't know why, but every time I reminded myself that it's my job, it's my responsibility to protect all those lives of the people that are getting on those airplanes, that are really entrusting to all of us. But me in the security role, I would remind myself that I've got to do everything that I possibly can, and certainly with my people in my department. But it's my personal responsibility for every life that people that, we're responsible for, people stepping onto those airplanes. And I don't know why I did it. It's just one of those things that every time I'd see those airplanes, I would remind myself of that. So it's still, I mean, aviation is part of my life. It's part of me. It's part of my soul, as is football. But I would remind myself every time. And when 9/11 happened, and even before that, when we had plane crashes or we had situations like that, those will be reminders. And frankly, out of 9/11, after 9/11, I spent a lot of time thinking about what could I have done to eliminate this. Where did I fail? Where did I go wrong? I mean, I took it personally.
Yeah.
In the back of my mind, I knew that was certainly not the case.
Not the case. Yeah.
But it was still there. It was still there.
Is there a point where you finally stopped yourself from asking that question so that you could get on with things?
In a sense that I knew that was not the case. Okay. And I would have to tell myself, okay, let's get off it.
Yeah.
Let's back off this. You know better. Okay. You've got a mission. You've got a job to do. You need to focus on that. Put it aside, get after it. And that's how I really functioned, going back to even my law enforcement days and everything else. Wansley, get over it. You know better. Get after it and go do your job.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Let's move forward a little bit in time. So after American Airlines, you got a job offer from the Dallas Cowboys. How did that come about? I know you'd been involved with the NFL before American, but how did they just suddenly come back to you and say, we want you?
Well, my relationship with the Cowboys always existed. I was with the Cowboys before I went to American Airlines. So it was a continuum, if you will. And then when I officially retired from American Airlines, just simply went back to the football world. But ironically, at that time, and even now, I work closely with my son. My son grew up around the business. When I first got into it, he was like 8 or 9 years old. And he was one of those kids, as other coaches' sons and other staff members' sons were. They worked on the sidelines and they were around the team and players, and they understood, they were exposed to, I'll put it that way.
He must have loved it. He must have loved it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so consequently, he had a long experience, and he majored in sports management and so forth. So it was a natural progression. When I went to the airline, he took over a lot of the things that I was responsible for with the team. And we continued to have those contacts, relationships, and everything. I was always there, but I wanted him to grow and do his thing.
Sure.
And then when I retired from American, I went back into the football world, keeping my hand in the aviation side of things, because I would do consulting and training and assessments and airline and all that. Also.
Yeah.
But in any case, so it was a continual type thing. It wasn't a big transition at all, because basically I was living in both those worlds all the time.
Wow. That's amazing. It's amazing to be able to do that. You have very broad shoulders.
Well, I don't know about that. I just sort of describe it as, hey, I'm just an old country guy from a little one-horse town in Missouri that happened to have been put into situations that I really learned a great deal from. And the incredible thing was the people involved in every one of those. I mean, I had the great fortune of just meeting and coming to know and work with phenomenal people all over the world. And those friendships are absolutely enduring. They exist today. And I feel blessed because of it.
Wonderful. I wanted to ask you, there's always two sides to everything. And I know that in all of the major sports that drugs can be an issue. And it's been documented that drugs and depression go hand in hand. Addiction goes hand in hand with depression. What have you seen in regards to that? And how is that being addressed?
Well, I can tell you from personal experience, when I first joined the Dallas Cowboys, my role as described to me by, my boss, who was the president and general manager, who hired me, Tech Schramm, and the head coach at the time was Tom Landry, the first coach of the Dallas Cowboys.
Right.
And they were visionaries. They saw, and particularly Tech saw what was happening in the world, in the NFL, put it that way. And he really got ahead of it and brought me on. And when I asked, what's my job description, he said, your job description is to help the players, to get them to the point where there's nothing in their lives that's interfering with their ability to be the best football player possible. And at that time, in the NFL, there were phenomenal problems with cocaine addiction, cocaine use, and what have you. And my perspective was one where, coming from law enforcement and that world, if you will, life was simple. Drugs, narcotics, jail. It's just that simple. Okay. That wasn't the case here, because when I came on board, and it was amidst a lot of media attention, Cowboys hire or FBI super spy, et cetera, et cetera. And everybody kind of put their own spin on it. We didn't really talk much about it, but one of the first things that happened to me was true players, well-known players, came to me, and they did this individually. They didn't powwow before that, but each of them basically made the same proclamation, and that is, they had pretty much done everything that could be done wrong, every wrong thing, every bad experience and everything else. They have been there, and they wanted to commit to helping me help their brother player.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
I've been there, Larry, I've been there. I've done this, and this, confessional. I've been there. So anything I can do to help you help my brother player, that's what I wanted. So one of the first things that I learned, and one of the most profound lessons that I learned, was this experience, in the sense that one of the first things I did is I went to a treatment program. I went to the Hazelden treatment program in Minnesota to learn about addicts. What does a person endure? What do they go through? How does it affect them, and whatever? To learn more about that side of it. I knew the law enforcement side. You can't lock everybody up.
Right.
And I knew about that side of it, but I went and I became one of them. Now, they had to approve me being a part of their lives for that 28 days. Every one of them did. Some were confused about it at first, but when they learned that I'm there to learn more and learn more from them through their experiences and everything else, so that I can help someone else. And it was that first period of time, that first session, if you will, for those 28 days, they really comprised the most important lesson that I ever learned. I learned so much about people. I learned so much about what brought them to that particular situation. I learned about their ups and their downs, of their tragedies, you name it, because as you know, in those settings, it all comes out. And some of the toughest people that I encountered and learned were the addicts themselves, because they didn't take any glossing over or any excuses for me. I mean, they were tough, and I learned so much from them, and the bonds that really were developed right then were so profound for me that, I walked away a different person. I really did. I truly had a good foundation of the fact that people go through so many things, so many struggles, and there are repeat periods and so forth. It was such a profound thing with me, educationally, and as a person, as growing and developing. that for my first 6 years in the NFL with the Dallas Cowboys, during the off season, I would go into a full-blown treatment program someplace around the country, different programs, to learn about the latest, for lack of a better description, or to get more exposure to people and the issues and how people can be helped with the various programs and resources. So I look back on all the years and the times that I've in situations that I've experienced, but I would have to say that from a human standpoint, from a person-to-person standpoint, to try understanding how people wind up in those kinds of situations, and the depression, the pain, the struggles that they go through. It's an everyday part of life. And I just feel so blessed to have been exposed to that, because it's given me a better sense of feeling whole and being able to, for lack of a better description, I don't have the answers. I've been exposed to a lot. And one thing about it is I'll always have an opinion, but I just have this burning desire to really be of assistance and help to people. And what I experienced during those years, especially going through those various programs, helped me immensely.
Well, I just thank you for having done all of that, because learning what you did and the impact that it had on you is something that becomes a part of you and you take into everything else that you do. So
absolutely,
that's a huge commitment, and thank you for having done that. Your book is FBI Undercover, The True Story of Special Agent Mandrake, which was your nickname that you kept.
Right.
I want to read all of the book. I'm fascinated by the little bit that I know about it. And my book, You Aren't Depression's Victim, which is out now, available in Kindle and paperback. Larry, thank you so much for your time and for being on this. I hope that I get to have you come back and talk with me again, because there's so much more we can talk about.
Well, I truly enjoyed it. I'm grateful for the time, and I look forward to reading your book. I'm working on another one about all the crazy stuff that goes on around the world, and in terms of the aviation world, and certainly 9/11 was at the heart of all that.
Okay,
I wish
good.
you a great day. I've truly enjoyed it, and Godspeed.
And you too. Thank you, Larry. Bye-bye.
Bye now.